I'm 47 years old now, and for the last 38 years, I've been keeping a secret that would sound absolutely insane if I told anyone outside my immediate family. In the winter of 1986, when I was just 9 years old, I found a baby in the woods behind my family's property in Northern California. Not a human baby, something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. His name is Cedar, at least that's what I've always called him, and he's a Bigfoot. I raised him from infancy, watched him grow from a helpless infant into something magnificent and terrifying, and what happened when he hit adolescence nearly destroyed everything I loved. This is the story I've never been able to tell, the truth about what it means to love something the world says can't be real, and the terrible price my family paid for that love. It was February 6th, 1986. I remember the date exactly because it was my 9th birthday, and instead of the birthday party my mother had planned, I spent the day in our barn with a creature that was dying, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning with the morning that changed everything. We lived on 40 acres of forested land in Humboldt County, California, about 12 miles outside the town of Willow Creek. My father, Robert Chen, was a timber consultant who worked with logging companies to survey forest land. My mother, Patricia, taught 4th grade at the local elementary school. We had a simple life, a 2-story farmhouse built in 1963, a red barn that my father had converted into a workshop, and endless acres of Douglas fir and redwood forest stretching behind our property into the 6 Rivers National Forest. I was an only child, quiet and bookish, the kind of kid who preferred exploring the woods alone to playing with other children. My parents worried about me sometimes. They'd catch me talking to myself during my long walks through the forest, having elaborate conversations with imaginary friends. What they didn't know was that I wasn't talking to myself. I was talking to the forest, to the trees and the birds and the deer, creating stories about the wild things that lived just beyond our sight. That morning, my birthday morning, I woke up early. The sun hadn't risen yet, and frost covered the windows of my bedroom in delicate crystalline patterns. I could hear my mother moving around downstairs, probably starting breakfast and preparing for the small birthday celebration she'd planned. "Just family," she'd said. "Your father, me, and your grandmother. Nothing fancy, but we'll make it special." I got dressed in my warmest clothes, thermal underwear, jeans, a thick flannel shirt, my winter coat, and the boots my father had bought me for Christmas. Something was pulling me outside. I can't explain it better than that. It was like a voice in my head, urgent and insistent, telling me I needed to go into the woods. Now, immediately, I crept downstairs, careful to avoid the squeaky step halfway down. My mother was in the kitchen, her back to me, humming softly as she worked. I grabbed my father's old flashlight from the mudroom, the heavy metal kind that could double as a weapon if you needed it to, and slipped out the back door into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. My breath came out in thick white clouds and the frost crunched under my boots with every step. I turned on the flashlight and headed into the trees, following the narrow deer path that wound behind our barn. I'd walked this path hundreds of times, knew every twist and turn, every fallen log and moss-covered rock. But that morning, everything felt different. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Just an eerie, heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating patches of frost-covered ferns and the massive trunks of old-growth redwoods. And then I heard it, a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a cry, high-pitched and desperate, like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal, something in between that triggered every instinct in my body to turn around and run home. But I didn't run. Instead, I followed the sound, pushing through thick underbrush, my coat snagging on branches, my face getting scratched by twigs. The crying got louder, more insistent, mixed now with other sounds, low guttural noises that might have been distress or pain or fear. I emerged into a small clearing, and my flashlight beam landed on something that made me forget how to breathe. There were two of them, two massive shapes lying on the forest floor. The larger one was motionless, obviously dead. Its body was covered in thick, reddish-brown fur, and even lying down it was enormous, easily 9 or 10 feet long. The face was unlike anything I'd seen in books or at the zoo, somewhere between a gorilla and a human, with a pronounced brow ridge, a flat nose, and lips that were pulled back in what might have been a final grimace of pain. And beside this massive dead creature, partially hidden beneath one of its huge arms, was something small and moving, the source of the crying, a baby. I approached slowly, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The baby was tiny compared to the adult, maybe 2 feet long, covered in lighter reddish-brown fur that was matted with what looked like dried blood. Its face was scrunched up as it cried, little hands waving helplessly in the air. It was clearly newborn, maybe just hours or days old, and it was going to die out here in the cold if I didn't do something. I knelt down beside them, close enough now to see that the adult had clearly been female. Her abdomen was swollen and distended, and there was blood on the ground beneath her. She'd died giving birth, I realized. Died bringing this tiny creature into the world. And now that tiny creature was alone, abandoned, freezing in the February cold. The baby's cries had weakened. It was shivering violently, its little body convulsing with cold and hunger. I knew I should go get help, tell my parents, call someone. But who would I call? The police? They'd think I was crazy. Animal control. They'd probably shoot it or take it away to some government laboratory where they'd spend years dissecting it, studying it, treating it like a specimen instead of a living being. No, I couldn't let that happen. So I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I took off my winter coat, wrapped the baby carefully in it, and picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, maybe 15 pounds. Solid and warm despite the shivering. The moment I lifted it, the crying stopped. The baby's eyes, dark and surprisingly human-looking, opened and focused on my face. And I swear, even at 9 years old, I understood what I saw in those eyes. Recognition, trust, hope. "I'm going to take care of you," I whispered, "I promise." I carried the baby back through the woods, moving as quickly as I could without jostling it too much. The sky was starting to lighten, that gray pre-dawn glow that meant my parents would be waking up soon, would notice I was gone. I had to get to the barn without them seeing me, had to figure out what to do, how to help this creature without exposing it to the world. When I reached our property, I went straight to the barn. My father had converted half of it into a workshop where he kept his surveying equipment and tools. The other half was used for storage, old furniture, boxes of my mother's teaching supplies, things we didn't need but couldn't quite throw away. There was a small room in the back, originally built to house livestock we'd never ended up getting, with a wooden floor, solid walls, and a door that locked from the outside. I brought the baby into that room, set it down gently on an old blanket I found in a storage box, and took my first real look at what I'd rescued. It was definitely a primate, that much was clear. The body structure was similar to a gorilla or chimpanzee, with long arms, powerful legs, and hands that looked almost human. But the face was different, more human than any ape I'd seen in pictures. The eyes especially. They were brown and clear and full of intelligence that seemed impossible for something so young. The baby was still shivering, so I piled more blankets on top of it, creating a warm nest. Then I realized the next problem. It was starving, Newborn animals need to eat frequently, and this one had probably been without food for hours, maybe since its mother died. I ran back to the house, my mind racing. My mother was in the kitchen making pancakes, and my father was reading the newspaper at the table. I forced myself to act normal, wished them good morning, accepted their birthday hugs, all while my thoughts were on the creature in the barn. "Mom," I said as casually as I could manage, "do we have any baby bottles? You know, the kind for feeding puppies or kittens?" She looked at me curiously. "Why would we need those, sweetie? I found a kitten in the woods," I lied. My first lie in what would become years of lying to protect my secret. "It's really tiny, and I think it might be abandoned. I thought maybe I could help it." My mother's expression softened. She had a kind heart. "My mom couldn't stand to see anything suffer. Oh, honey, that's sweet of you, but you should have told us immediately. We need to call a veterinarian or an animal rescue. Can we just try to help it first?" I pleaded. "Just for today? It's my birthday, please." She looked at my father, who shrugged. "It's your birthday," he said. "I guess it couldn't hurt to try. But if the kitten doesn't improve quickly, we call professionals." "Agreed. Agreed," I said, even though I had no intention of ever calling anyone. My mother found an old baby bottle in the basement, left over from when I was an infant, and showed me how to mix formula. "Not kitten formula," she said. "We don't have that. But regular infant formula should work for now. Just keep it warm and feed it every couple of hours." I took the bottle and practically ran back to the barn. The baby was still wrapped in blankets, but the crying had started again. Weaker now, more desperate. I knelt beside it, lifted it carefully, and tried to figure out how to feed it. It took several attempts. The baby didn't seem to understand what the bottle was, kept turning its head away, making frustrated noises. But finally, whether by instinct or luck, its mouth found the nipple and it began to suck. The relief was immediate. The baby drank hungrily, its tiny hands gripping the bottle with surprising strength. When it finished, it let out a small burp, exactly like a human baby, and I couldn't help but laugh. The baby's eyes were starting to close, exhaustion and a full belly finally catching up to it. I stayed in that barn room all day, my birthday forgotten. Every 2 hours, I'd mix a new bottle and feed the baby. In between feedings, I just watched it sleep, studied every detail of its face and body, tried to understand what exactly I'd found. By evening, the baby seemed stronger, its color better, its breathing more regular. It was going to survive, I realized. This impossible creature was going to live. My parents eventually came looking for me, found me in the barn, and demanded to see the kitten I'd supposedly rescued. That was my first real test. I showed them the baby, still wrapped in blankets so they couldn't see its full form, and held my breath while my mother examined it. "That's not a kitten," she said immediately. "Honey, what is this?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I found it in the woods with its mother. The mother was dead and this baby was alone and crying. I couldn't just leave it." My father knelt down for a closer look. The baby opened its eyes and looked directly at him, and I saw his expression change. Recognition of something unusual, something significant. He reached out slowly, gently pulled back the blanket to reveal one of the tiny hands. The baby's fingers wrapped around his index finger, holding on with surprising strength. "My God," he whispered. "Patricia, look at this." My mother came closer, and when she saw the baby's hand gripping my father's finger, saw the structure of the fingers and the opposable thumb, she gasped. "Robert, what is it? What kind of animal?" "I think," my father said slowly, carefully, measuring each word, "that we need to keep this very quiet. I think what our daughter has found is something that officially doesn't exist." My mother looked at him, then at me, then at the baby. She understood what he was saying, what he was implying. And I saw the moment she made her choice. The same choice I'd made in the forest that morning, to protect this creature no matter what. That night, after we'd fed the baby again and made sure it was warm and comfortable, my parents sat me down in the barn and explained what was going to happen. We were going to keep the baby, raise it as best we could, and absolutely no one outside our family could ever know. My grandmother, who was supposed to visit for my birthday, would be told I had the flu. Friends, neighbors, everyone would be kept away from our property. The secret had to be absolute because if anyone found out, the consequences would be catastrophic. "Do you understand, Eleanor?" my father asked, using my full name, which he only did when things were serious. "This isn't a game or a pet. This is probably the most important discovery in modern biology, and we're choosing to hide it, to protect it. That means your life is going to change. No more sleepovers with friends. No inviting kids over to play. No casual conversations about what you do at home. Can you handle that?" I looked at the baby, sleeping peacefully in its nest of blankets, and nodded. "I can handle it. I want to protect it." My mother pulled me into a hug. "Okay," she said, "then we do this together, as a family." And that's how it began. That's how a 9-year-old girl, her parents, and an infant Bigfoot became the most unusual family in California, maybe in the world. We named him Cedar after the cedar trees that surrounded our property. My father built a proper enclosure in the barn, something secure but comfortable, with heating for the cold nights and plenty of space for Cedar to move around as he grew. We researched primate care, bought books about raising gorillas and chimpanzees, and adapted what we learned to Cedar's needs. He grew fast, alarmingly fast. By the end of his first month, he'd doubled in size. By 6 months, he was as big as a 5-year-old child. But despite his rapid physical growth, mentally and emotionally, he developed more like a human baby. He was curious about everything, loved to play, and formed strong attachments to all three of us, but especially to me. I was the first face he'd seen, the first voice he'd heard, and in his mind, I was his mother. I spent every free moment with Cedar. Before school, I'd go to the barn and feed him breakfast. After school, I'd do my homework, sitting in his enclosure while he played with toys my mother bought, wooden blocks and rubber balls and stuffed animals. At night, I'd read to him, children's books at first, then more complex stories as he got older. He couldn't speak, his vocal anatomy wasn't designed for human language, but he understood everything. He'd nod or shake his head to answer yes or no questions. He'd point at things he wanted. He'd even learned simple sign language, basic ASL signs my mother taught him. By the time Cedar turned 1 year old, in February 1987, he was nearly 5 feet tall and probably weighed 80 pounds. He looked like a small gorilla covered in reddish-brown fur, but his face was more human-like than any ape, with expressions that were heartbreakingly familiar. He could smile, laugh, show sadness and joy and fear and love. He was, in every way that mattered, a person. A person who just happened to be covered in fur and couldn't speak. Those early years were the happiest of my life. I grew up alongside Cedar, taught him everything I learned in school, shared my dreams and fears with him. He was my best friend, my brother, my responsibility. When I was sad, he'd wrap his long arms around me in what could only be called a hug. When I was happy, he'd bounce around excitedly, making that huffing sound that was his version of laughter. When I cried, he'd bring me tissues, gently pat my face, try to comfort me in any way he could. My parents were equally attached. My father built elaborate climbing structures for Cedar, platforms and ropes and tree-like poles that allowed him to exercise and play safely within the barn. My mother sang to him the same lullabies she'd sung to me as a baby, and Cedar would close his eyes and hum along, creating harmonies that were both beautiful and otherworldly. But as Cedar grew, so did the challenges. By age 3, he was over 6 feet tall, and weighed close to 200 pounds. He was strong, incredibly strong, able to bend metal bars with his hands and break thick ropes like they were string. We had to constantly reinforce his enclosure, add stronger locks, thicker walls. Not because Cedar wanted to escape, he never tried, but because we had to make sure he couldn't accidentally break out if he got excited during play. And then there were the close calls. Once, when Cedar was 4 years old, a social worker came to our house for a routine visit, something to do with my mother's teaching license. Cedar was in the barn, and he started making noise, loud vocalizations that carried across the property. My father had to turn up the radio to drown it out, claim we had a problem with local coyotes. Another time, a neighbor's dog got loose and ran into our barn, barking frantically at Cedar's enclosure. We found the dog 3 hours later, hiding under our porch, traumatized but unharmed. Cedar had apparently roared at it, a sound so loud and terrifying it had sent the dog running in blind panic. But we managed. We adapted. We kept our secret. And Cedar continued to grow, continued to learn, continued to be the most important thing in our lives. Then Cedar hit puberty. He was 12 years old, the year 1998, and everything changed. Not slowly, not gradually, but almost overnight. He grew another foot in height, reaching nearly 8 feet tall. His shoulders broadened dramatically, becoming twice as wide as my father's. His muscles became more defined, more powerful, and his behavior, his gentle, loving behavior, began to shift in ways that scared all of us. He became aggressive, not toward us directly, but toward everything else. He'd destroy his toys in fits of rage, tear apart the wooden climbing structures my father had built, pound on the walls of his enclosure hard enough to crack the reinforced concrete. He stopped wanting to play, stopped responding to our attempts to comfort him. His eyes, once so clear and intelligent and kind, now held something else, something wild and dangerous and barely controlled. My father said it was normal that male primates often became more aggressive during adolescence, that it was just hormones and Cedar would settle down eventually. My mother was less sure. She'd watch Cedar through the observation window my father had installed in his enclosure, and I'd see the worry on her face, the fear that we were losing him, that the gentle creature we'd raised was being replaced by something we couldn't control. I was 17 years old by then, a senior in high school, and I couldn't accept that Cedar was changing. I still went to the barn every day, still tried to maintain our connection, but Cedar wasn't the same. When I'd enter his enclosure, he'd ignore me, turn his back, sometimes even bare his teeth in a warning display. The creature who'd once hugged me and comforted me now seemed to resent my presence. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was October 31st, 1998, Halloween night. I'd stayed home from the school dance to be with Cedar, worried about how agitated he'd been lately. My parents had gone into town for dinner, a rare evening out, leaving me alone on the property. I was in Cedar's enclosure, sitting on the floor, trying to read to him like I used to. He was pacing, back and forth, making low guttural sounds that raised the hair on my arms. I should have left, should have recognized the signs of aggression, the danger, but I was stubborn, convinced that I could still reach him, that our bond was strong enough to overcome whatever he was going through. "Cedar," I said softly, "do you want to hear the rest of the story?" He stopped pacing and looked at me. For a moment I saw recognition in his eyes, a flash of the gentle creature he'd been. But then something else took over. His lip curled back, revealing teeth that had grown large and sharp during puberty. He made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a roar and a scream, filled with rage and frustration and something that might have been pain. I stood up slowly, trying to appear calm even though my heart was hammering. "It's okay," I said. "I'll go. I'll give you space." But as I turned toward the door, Cedar moved, faster than I would have thought possible. He crossed the distance between us and grabbed my arm. Not gently, not the careful grip he'd always used before, but hard, painfully hard, his fingers digging into my flesh with crushing force. I gasped in pain and fear, tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. His face was inches from mine now, and I could smell his breath, musky and wild, could see the fury burning in his eyes. He lifted me off the ground as easily as I might lift a rag doll, my feet dangling, my arms screaming in agony. "Cedar, please," I begged. "It's me. It's Eleanor. You know me." For a moment, nothing changed. He held me there, suspended in the air, and I was certain he was going to hurt me, maybe kill me. But then something shifted in his expression. The rage faded slightly, replaced by confusion and what might have been horror at what he was doing. He lowered me to the ground, released my arm, and stepped back, making a sound that was unmistakably distressed. I ran. I didn't stop to think, didn't try to comfort him or explain. I just ran out of the enclosure, slammed the reinforced door behind me, and collapsed against the wall, cradling my injured arm. When I finally looked at it, I saw deep bruises already forming, the clear imprint of Cedar's fingers, and I knew with certainty that everything had changed. The creature I'd loved and protected for 12 years had become something dangerous, something I could no longer trust. That was just the beginning. What happened in the months that followed, as Cedar's adolescence spiraled into something darker and more terrifying, would test our family in ways we never imagined and force us to make choices that still haunt me 38 years later. When my parents came home that night, they found me sitting in the kitchen with an ice pack on my arm. I'd changed into a long-sleeved shirt to hide the bruises, but my mother knew something was wrong the moment she saw my face. "What happened, Eleanor?" she asked, setting down her purse and coming to sit beside me. I tried to lie at first, said I'd tripped and fallen against the barn door, but my father went out to check on Cedar and came back with a grim expression. "The enclosure is damaged," he said quietly. "The walls. It looks like he was throwing himself against them. And there's blood on the concrete floor. Is that yours, Eleanor?" I couldn't hide it anymore. I rolled up my sleeve and showed them the bruises, the clear finger marks, the swelling that had already made my arm twice its normal size. "Cedar grabbed me," I admitted. "I don't think he meant to hurt me. I think he was confused, overwhelmed by whatever he's feeling right now, but he's so strong and he couldn't control it." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh God, Eleanor, we need to take you to the hospital. That could be fractured." "No hospital," I said firmly. "They'll ask questions. How do I explain bruises shaped like giant fingers? We can't risk anyone finding out about Cedar." My father examined my arm carefully. He'd had some basic first aid training for his work in the forests. "I don't think it's broken," he said finally. "Severely bruised, but the bones feel intact. We'll wrap it, keep ice on it, and watch for signs of serious damage. But Eleanor, you can't go into his enclosure alone anymore. Not until we understand what's happening with him." I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Cedar was still himself, that this was just a temporary phase, but I couldn't, because deep down I knew my father was right. Something fundamental had shifted in Cedar, and none of us knew if the gentle creature we'd raised would ever fully return. The next few weeks were agonizing. Cedar became increasingly isolated, refusing to eat when we were present, destroying everything we put in his enclosure. The sounds he made at night kept all of us awake, howls and roars that echoed across the property. We were terrified a neighbor would hear, would come investigating, but our nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, and the thick forest seemed to absorb most of the noise. My father tried to research what we were dealing with, spent hours at the university library in Arcata, reading everything he could find about primate behavior, gorilla adolescence, chimpanzee aggression. He came back with theories but no real answers. "We're in uncharted territory," he said one evening as we sat around the dinner table, all of us exhausted from sleepless nights. "No one has ever raised a Sasquatch from infancy. We have no idea what normal development looks like for them, what behaviors are typical, and what might be concerning. Maybe we should contact someone," my mother suggested hesitantly. "A primatologist, someone who studies great apes. We could present it hypothetically, ask for advice without revealing Cedar." My father shook his head. "Too risky. Any expert would want to see the subject, would ask questions we can't answer. No, we handle this ourselves. We've managed for 12 years. We'll manage through this too." But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that we'd made a terrible mistake all those years ago in the barn, that maybe the kind thing, the right thing, would have been to let nature take its course, to let the baby die with its mother in the forest, rather than raise it in captivity, isolated from its own kind. I couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept it. Cedar was my responsibility, my brother in every way that mattered. I'd made him a promise that February morning when I wrapped him in my coat and carried him home. I'd promised to take care of him, to protect him, and I wasn't going to give up on him now, no matter how difficult things became. In early November, about 2 weeks after the incident, I tried to reconnect with Cedar. I didn't go into his enclosure, that was too dangerous now, but I sat outside the observation window every evening after school and talked to him. I told him about my day, about college applications I was working on, about how much I missed him, missed our connection. Most of the time he ignored me, paced restlessly, or sat in the corner with his back turned. But occasionally he'd glance at the window, and I'd see something in his eyes that gave me hope, recognition, maybe even longing. Then came Thanksgiving. My grandmother was supposed to visit, something my mother had been unable to avoid without raising suspicion. We'd kept her away from the property for years with various excuses, but this year she'd insisted. "I'm not getting any younger," she told my mother on the phone. "I want to spend the holiday with my family, all of my family." We prepared carefully. My father reinforced Cedar's enclosure door with additional locks. We soundproofed the barn walls as much as we could, adding insulation and heavy blankets. We stocked Cedar's space with enough food for several days, so we wouldn't need to enter during my grandmother's visit. And we prayed that he'd stay quiet, that nothing would go wrong. My grandmother arrived on Wednesday evening, the day before Thanksgiving. She was 73 years old, sharp-minded and observant, with my mother's kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that came from growing up during the Great Depression. She hugged me tightly when she arrived, commented on how grown-up I looked, how I'd inherited my father's height and my mother's features. Then she looked around the property and asked the question we'd been dreading. "What's in the barn?" I heard something making noise on my way in. "Do you have livestock now?" "Just storage," my father said quickly, "and a family of raccoons has taken up residence in the loft. We're trying to encourage them to leave, but they're stubborn." My grandmother accepted this explanation, though I saw her glance toward the barn several times that evening, her expression thoughtful. We had a pleasant dinner, caught up on family news, avoided any topics that might lead to questions about our isolated lifestyle. I went to bed that night feeling cautiously optimistic that we'd make it through the visit without incident. I was wrong. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on Thanksgiving Day, Cedar started screaming. Not the howls or roars we'd become accustomed to, but genuine screams of distress, so loud and terrible that they woke everyone in the house. I bolted out of bed and ran downstairs, nearly colliding with my parents in the hallway. My grandmother was right behind us, wrapped in her bathrobe, her face pale with concern. "What on earth is that sound?" she demanded. "Robert, Patricia, what's happening?" My father tried to deflect, to claim it was coyotes or an injured deer, but the screaming continued, and it was clearly coming from our barn. My mother grabbed my arm, held me back as my father headed for the door. "Stay here with your grandmother," she ordered. "Your father and I will handle this." But my grandmother wasn't having it. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "If there's an injured animal on your property, an extra pair of hands might be useful, and I'm not so old that I can't help." So we all went, the four of us rushing across the frost-covered grass, in our pajamas and coats, flashlights cutting through the darkness. My father unlocked the barn, and the screaming got louder, more desperate. He turned to my grandmother one last time. "Mrs. Morrison, please wait here. This might be disturbing." "I've seen disturbing things before," she replied. "Open the door, Robert." And he did. We entered the barn, and there was no hiding it anymore. No way to pretend, to lie, to keep the secret. My grandmother saw everything. She saw the reinforced enclosure taking up half the barn. She saw the observation window and the heavy steel door with multiple locks. She saw the massive shape inside, pacing and screaming, throwing itself against the walls with such force the entire structure shook. And then Cedar saw us. He stopped mid-scream, turned toward the window, and in the light from our flashlights, my grandmother got her first clear look at the creature we'd been hiding for 12 years. I watched her face change, watched shock and disbelief and finally understanding wash over her features. She swayed slightly, and my mother caught her arm, steadied her. "That's impossible," my grandmother whispered. "That's not real. That can't be real." "Grandma," I said softly, moving to stand beside her, "I want you to meet Cedar. He's been part of our family since I was 9 years old, since the day I found him in the forest, orphaned and dying, and brought him home. He's real, and we've been protecting him all this time." My grandmother looked at me, then at my parents, then back at the massive figure in the enclosure. Cedar had stopped pacing and was standing still now, watching us through the window. Even in his agitated state, even after everything that had happened, I saw a flash of curiosity in his eyes. A stranger, someone new, something different from the routine he'd known his entire life. "This is what you've been hiding," my grandmother said, her voice strange and distant. "This is why you never let me visit, why you've isolated yourselves for years, because you've been raising a Sasquatch in your barn." "Yes," my father said simply, "because we made a choice. Eleanor made a choice to protect something that would have died otherwise, to give it a chance at life, even if that life had to be secret." My grandmother was silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving Cedar. Then she did something that surprised all of us. She moved closer to the observation window, right up to the glass, and placed her palm flat against it. Cedar tilted his head, studying her with obvious interest. Then slowly, carefully, he raised his own massive hand and placed it against the glass opposite hers. "Hello, Cedar," my grandmother said softly. "I'm Eleanor's grandmother. I'm very pleased to meet you." And just like that, with those simple words, Cedar calmed. The agitation that had been building for weeks seemed to drain out of him. He lowered his hand, moved away from the window, and settled into his nest of blankets in the corner of his enclosure. Within minutes, he was asleep, exhausted from his outburst. We stood there in the barn, the four of us, watching Cedar sleep. My grandmother turned to look at us, and I saw tears running down her weathered cheeks. "You've taken on an impossible burden," she said. "A beautiful, terrible, impossible burden, and you've carried it alone for so long. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. I'm part of this family, which means I'm part of this secret now. Whatever comes next, we face it together." That Thanksgiving Day, we didn't have a traditional feast. Instead, we sat in the barn, all of us, including my grandmother, and we talked. We told her everything. about finding Cedar, about raising him, about the joy he'd brought to our lives and the fear we lived with every day, about the changes we'd seen in him recently, the aggression and unpredictability, about the incident with my arm, which I showed her, the bruises now a spectacular purple and yellow. My grandmother listened to everything, asked thoughtful questions, and finally offered the perspective we'd been missing. "He's lonely," she said simply. "He's going through adolescence, which is hard enough for any creature, but he's doing it completely isolated from his own kind. He has no one to teach him how to be what he is, no peers to socialize with, no outlet for these new feelings and instincts. It's no wonder he's struggling." "What do we do?" my mother asked. "We can't exactly take him to meet other Sasquatch. We don't even know if there are others in this area." "Maybe not," my grandmother said. "But we can try to give him more space, more stimulation, more reasons to engage with life beyond these walls. And most importantly, we need to help him understand that he's not being punished or abandoned, that we still love him even when he can't always control himself." Over the following weeks, we implemented my grandmother's suggestions. My father built a larger outdoor enclosure, hidden deep in the forest behind our property, surrounded by tall fencing designed to look natural. We started taking Cedar there during the night, letting him experience real trees and dirt and sky, giving him room to move and climb and express himself. My grandmother, who'd decided to extend her visit indefinitely, began working with Cedar on a regular schedule, talking to him through the observation window, teaching him more complex sign language, treating him not as a dangerous animal, but as a troubled adolescent who needed guidance and patience. And slowly, gradually, Cedar began to improve. The violent outbursts became less frequent. The destruction lessened. He started eating regularly again, started responding to our attempts to communicate. By Christmas, he'd grown another 6 inches and probably gained 50 pounds, topping out at 8.5 feet tall and close to 400 pounds of pure muscle. But despite his intimidating size, the gentleness we'd thought was lost forever began to return. He'd press his hand against the observation window when I'd sit with him. He'd make soft vocalizations when my grandmother sang to him. He'd even play gently with the toys my father made, instead of destroying them. We'd survived the crisis. We'd made it through Cedar's adolescence, or at least the worst of it. And we'd gained an unexpected ally in my grandmother, whose wisdom and compassion had helped us find our way when we'd been completely lost. I graduated from high school that spring, 1999, and chose to attend Humboldt State University, just 45 minutes from home, so I could continue to be part of Cedar's life. Because even though he was calmer, more stable, I knew the real challenges were still ahead. Cedar was nearly full-grown now, a magnificent and terrifying creature living in secret in rural California. And someday, somehow, we'd have to figure out what the future held for him, for all of us. But for now, in those quiet months after we'd nearly lost everything, we were just grateful. Grateful that we'd held together as a family, grateful that Cedar had found his way back to us, grateful that we'd been given more time with this impossible, beautiful being who'd changed our lives forever. The hardest parts were still to come, but we didn't know that yet. We had a few more years of relative peace before everything would fall apart in ways we could never have anticipated. The peaceful years lasted until 2003. I was 26 years old by then, had graduated from Humboldt State with a degree in environmental science, and was working for the California Department of Forestry. Cedar was 17, fully grown at 9 feet tall and probably weighing close to 600 pounds. He'd matured into something breathtaking, a creature of such power and grace that sometimes I'd just watch him through the observation window and marvel at what we'd accomplished. We'd raised him from a helpless infant to a healthy adult, kept kept him safe and hidden for 17 years. It felt like a miracle. My father had retired the previous year, which made caring for Cedar easier. He and my grandmother, who'd officially moved in with us, took care of Cedar during the day while I was at work. My mother still taught, but she'd scaled back to part-time, spending her afternoons in the barn with Cedar, reading to him, talking to him, maintaining the bond they'd built over nearly 2 decades. We'd settled into a routine that felt sustainable. Cedar spent his days in the outdoor enclosure we'd built, weather permitting, and his nights in the barn. He was calm, engaged, responsive to our attempts to communicate. He'd learned over 100 signs in ASL, could express complex thoughts and emotions. He understood English perfectly, could follow multi-step instructions, could even read at what we estimated was a 5th grade level. My father had taught him basic mathematics, and Cedar could solve simple arithmetic problems, understand concepts like more and less, before and after. But he was also lonely. We all knew it, even if we didn't talk about it directly. Cedar had no contact with his own kind, no way to express the instincts and drives that all creatures have. We'd given him the best life we could, but it was fundamentally incomplete. He was living in a beautiful prison, cared for and loved, but still imprisoned. In March 2003, something happened that would force us to confront the sustainability of what we'd been doing. A documentary crew came to Willow Creek, filming a piece about Bigfoot sightings in Northern California. They interviewed locals, explored the forests, talked about the long history of Sasquatch legends in the area. My father saw them in town, came home deeply troubled. "They're getting close," he said that evening as we gathered in the living room. "They're interviewing people who've reported sightings within 5 miles of our property. They're talking about setting up trail cameras, doing overnight expeditions. Eleanor, if they find evidence of Cedar, even indirectly, we're finished. Our secret is finished." We'd always known this was a possibility, that someday someone might discover Cedar's existence, but we'd pushed that fear aside, focused on the day-to-day challenges of keeping him safe and hidden. Now, faced with the immediate threat of discovery, we had to make decisions we'd been avoiding for years. My grandmother was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Maybe it's time," she said quietly. "Time to let someone know. To find Cedar a place where he can be with others like him, if such a place exists." "There is no such place," my father said harshly. "If we reveal Cedar to anyone, scientists, government officials, anyone, they'll take him away from us. They'll study him, lock him in a facility, turn him into a specimen. I won't let that happen. I won't betray him that way." "So what's the alternative?" my mother asked. "We keep hiding him until eventually someone finds out anyway. And then what? They show up here with cameras and government agents and we lose him anyway. But we also lose any control over what happens to him." The argument went on for hours, voices rising and falling, old fears and new anxieties colliding. I sat quietly through most of it, watching my family fracture under the weight of the secret we'd carried so long. Finally, I spoke up. "I need to talk to Cedar," I said. "He's part of this family, which means he gets a say in what happens to his life. We've spent 17 years making decisions for him. Maybe it's time we let him make some decisions for himself." The next day, I went to Cedar's enclosure with a plan. I'd spent the night preparing a series of pictures and signs, a way to explain the situation to him in terms he could understand. I showed him images of other people, strangers, and signed the concept of danger. I showed him pictures of the forest and signed freedom. I showed him pictures of our family and signed safety, love, home. Then I asked him a question I'd never asked before, never dared to ask, because I was terrified of the answer. "Cedar, do you want to leave? Do you want to go into the forest, live wild, find others like you?" Cedar looked at the pictures for a long time. Then he looked at me, his dark eyes full of an intelligence that still sometimes shocked me. He reached out through the bars of the enclosure, something he rarely did, and gently touched my face with one massive finger. Then he signed something that made my eyes fill with tears. Home here, family here, stay. But what if staying isn't safe anymore? I asked. What if bad people come? People who want to take you away? Cedar was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he signed something that showed how much he'd grown, how much he understood about the complexity of his situation. If bad people come, family goes too. We go together, not alone, never alone. I understood what he was saying. If we had to run, if discovery became inevitable, he wanted us to go with him, to find a new place, a new way of living, but together. He wasn't willing to be abandoned, and he wasn't willing to abandon us either. In that moment, I realized something profound. We weren't just Cedar's family. Cedar was our family as much as any human could be, and families don't abandon each other, no matter how difficult the circumstances. I brought Cedar's message back to my parents and grandmother. We spent the next several days making contingency plans. My father scouted remote areas deep in the Six Rivers National Forest, places so isolated that even experienced hikers rarely ventured there. He identified locations where we could potentially set up a camp, where Cedar could live with more freedom, while we maintained some level of oversight and protection. My mother began researching off-grid living, how to survive in the wilderness long-term. I started setting aside money from my paychecks, creating an emergency fund for whatever might come. The documentary crew left Willow Creek after 2 weeks without finding anything concrete. We dodged that bullet, but we knew others would come. The legend of Bigfoot wasn't going away, and our area was considered prime territory for sightings. It was only a matter of time before someone got too close, before our careful constructed walls came tumbling down. For the next 2 years, we lived in a state of constant vigilance. Every car that drove past our property was a potential threat. Every hiker we encountered in town might be someone who'd venture too close to our land. We installed motion sensor cameras around our property, created a warning system that would alert us if anyone approached the barn or the outdoor enclosure. Cedar learned to recognize the alarm sound and knew to stay absolutely silent and still when it went off. But despite the stress, those years were also precious. Cedar was at his peak, healthy and strong and engaged with life. He'd taken up painting, using brushes my father had modified to fit his massive hands. His paintings were abstract but beautiful, swirls of color that seemed to express emotions he couldn't put into words. He loved music, everything from classical to rock and roll, and would sway to the rhythm, creating his own harmonies with his vocalizations. He'd even developed a sense of humor, playing gentle pranks on us, hiding our things and then pretending innocence when we couldn't find them. My grandmother's health began to fail in 2005. She was 80 years old and had developed congestive heart failure. She spent most of her time in a wheelchair, but she insisted on visiting Cedar every day. He was so gentle with her, so careful, as if he understood her fragility. He'd sit quietly while she read to him, her voice growing weaker with each passing week. He'd sign to her, tell her about his day, show her his paintings, and she'd smile, her wrinkled face lighting up with joy at this impossible bond she'd been privileged to witness. She died on September 12th, 2005, in her sleep. We found her in the morning, peaceful and still, her last breath taken sometime in the quiet hours before dawn. We were devastated, my mother especially, but we also knew we had to handle the logistics carefully. How do you mourn openly when you've been living secretly for so long? We wanted Cedar to be part of saying goodbye, to understand what had happened, to have closure. So before we called the authorities to report her death, we brought her to the barn one last time. We wheeled her chair to the observation window, and I went inside to get Cedar. Grandmother is gone, I signed to him. She died last night. She's not in pain anymore, but she's not coming back. Do you understand? Cedar's expression changed immediately. The confusion, the disbelief, and then the grief were so human it was heartbreaking. He made a sound, low and mournful, that I'd only heard him make once before when a bird he'd been watching had flown into the enclosure window and died. It was the sound of loss, of understanding that something precious was gone forever. Do you want to see her? I asked. To say goodbye? Cedar nodded, and we brought him out to the observation area. My father had taken down the glass from one section of the window, creating an opening. Cedar approached slowly, carefully, and reached through to gently touch my grandmother's hand. He held it for a long moment, his massive fingers wrapped around her frail ones. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture we'd seen him use before to show affection and respect. He stayed like that for several minutes, completely still, saying goodbye in the only way he knew how. When he finally pulled back, there were tears running down his face, actual tears, and I realized I'd never seen him cry before. He could express sadness, could show grief through vocalizations and body language, but these were real tears, the same as any human would shed. Thank you, grandmother, he signed, his movements slow and deliberate. Thank you for being kind. Thank you for family. After we'd called the authorities and dealt with the logistics of my grandmother's death, after the funeral and the grieving and the slow process of adjusting to life without her, something changed in Cedar. He became more withdrawn, spending long hours sitting silently in his enclosure, staring at nothing. He stopped painting, stopped engaging with music, stopped showing interest in the activities that had brought him joy. My mother was deeply worried, talked about depression, about the emotional toll of losing someone he'd loved. I spent more time with Cedar, trying to draw him out, but nothing seemed to help. He was going through his own grieving process, and we had to respect that, give him space and time to heal. But weeks turned into months, and Cedar's depression didn't lift. If anything, it seemed to deepen. Then came February 6th, 2006, Cedar's 20th birthday, exactly 20 years since I'd found him in the forest. My father had made a cake, something we did every year, and we gathered in the barn to celebrate. Cedar seemed more present than he had in months, actually engaging when we sang to him, reaching out to accept the cake my father had cut into pieces and pushed through the enclosure bars. After we finished singing, Cedar started signing, a long series of gestures that took several minutes to complete. I translated as he went, my voice catching as I understood what he was trying to tell us. He signed about being grateful for his life with us, for the love we'd given him, for keeping him safe and teaching him about the world. He signed about missing my grandmother, about understanding that death was part of life, that loss was inevitable. And then he signed something that made all of us go silent. Cedar signed, I understand now why Mother left me. I understand sacrifice. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes staying means everyone suffers. Sometimes leaving is gift. What are you saying, Cedar? I asked, my hands trembling as I signed. What do you mean? He looked at each of us in turn, his expression calm and sad and wise. I love you, he signed. You are my family forever, but I am making life hard, making life dangerous. You hide because of me. You worry because of me. You cannot live free because of me. No, I signed frantically. Cedar, no. We chose this. We wanted this. You're not a burden. I am burden, he signed firmly. But I can change. I can choose different. I choose to go. I choose forest. I choose to give you freedom. We argued with him for hours, all of us trying to convince him to stay, to not make this sacrifice. But Cedar was adamant. He'd thought about this carefully, had made his decision. He was 20 years old, fully adult by any measure, and he wanted to live wild, to give us back the normal lives we'd given up for him. He promised to stay close, to remain in the forests near our property, to let us know he was safe. But he couldn't stay in captivity anymore. Couldn't be the reason we lived in constant fear of discovery. It took us 2 weeks to accept his decision, to plan for what would happen. We waited for a new moon, for maximum darkness, and on February 24th, 2006, we opened Cedar's enclosure for the last time. My father had packed supplies, a tarp Cedar could use for shelter, some tools, non-perishable food to supplement what he could forage. We'd identified a cave system about 8 miles from our property, where Cedar could potentially make a home, somewhere remote and protected. Cedar stepped out of the barn and stood in the open air for the first time in years. He looked up at the stars, took deep breaths of the forest-scented air, and I saw something on his face that was unmistakably joy, mixed with sadness. He turned to look at each of us, and then he signed one last message. Thank you for life. Thank you for love. Thank you for being family when I had no one. I carry you in heart always. Not goodbye, just different way of being together. My mother was sobbing, clinging to my father. My father had tears streaming down his face. This man who rarely showed emotion, completely undone by the loss of the creature he'd protected for 2 decades. And I felt like my heart was being ripped out of my chest, watching Cedar prepare to leave, knowing I might never see him again. Cedar approached me last, leaned down so his face was level with mine, and pressed his forehead against mine, just as he'd done with my grandmother. I felt his breath on my face, smelled the familiar musky scent of him, memorized every detail of this moment because I knew it was ending, that this chapter of our lives was closing whether we wanted it to or not. I love you, little mother, he signed, using the name he'd called me since he was small. You saved me, now I save you. Then he turned and walked into the forest, moving silently despite his size, becoming one with the shadows and the trees. We watched until he disappeared, until even the sound of his passage had faded. And then we stood there in the cold February night, a family forever changed by the choice to love something impossible, by the sacrifice of letting it go. The months after Cedar left were the hardest of my life. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard him calling, only to realize it was just the wind. I'd go to the barn and expect to see him in his enclosure, forget for a moment that it was empty now that he was gone. My parents struggled too, my father throwing himself into projects around the property, my mother returning to full-time teaching, both of them trying to fill the cedar-shaped hole in their lives with activity and routine. But Cedar kept his promise. About once a month, we'd find signs that he'd been close to our property. Stones stacked in unnatural formations, a pattern we recognized from his childhood when he'd play with blocks. Painted rocks, colors he'd mixed from berries and clay, abstract designs that reminded us of the paintings he'd made. Once we found a deer carcass hung in a tree near our barn, meat cleaned and preserved in a way that showed intelligence and care, Cedar's way of providing for us even though we didn't need him to. And sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was bright, I'd go to the edge of our property and call out to him, just his name carried on the wind. And sometimes, if I was very quiet and very still, I'd hear a response, a low vocalization from deep in the forest that told me he was there, he was safe, he remembered. Years passed. I got married in 2008 to a man named James, who knew nothing about Cedar, nothing about the secret my family had kept. I wanted to tell him, ached to share that part of my life, but I'd made a promise. The secret stayed with my parents and me, a bond we could never fully explain to anyone else. I had 2 children, a daughter in 2010 and a son in 2012, and I raised them on the property where I'd grown up, never telling them why we owned so much forest land, why we never sold despite generous offers from developers. My father died in 2015, a massive heart attack that took him quickly and without warning. He was 72 years old, and he died knowing Cedar was free, living wild as he was meant to. At his funeral, I stood at the edge of the cemetery and saw something that made my breath catch. A massive figure standing just inside the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. Cedar, come to say goodbye to the man who'd protected him, who'd built him climbing structures and outdoor enclosures and a life worth living. He stayed only a moment, just long enough for me to see him, to know he understood, and then he was gone. My mother followed my father 6 years later, in 2021. Cancer, aggressive and unstoppable despite all the treatments. In her final days, she talked about Cedar, about the choice we'd made all those years ago to protect something beautiful and impossible. "I'm glad we did it," she said, her voice weak but certain. "I'm glad we gave him a chance, even though it was hard, even though we sacrificed so much. I'd do it all again." After she died, I inherited the property, all 40 acres and the barn where Cedar had lived for 20 years. My children were teenagers by then, 11 and 9, and I finally felt like it was time to tell them the truth, to pass on the secret and the responsibility of keeping it. So on a warm evening in June 2021, I brought them to the barn and told them the whole story, about finding a baby in the forest when I was their age, about raising him, loving him, protecting him, about watching him grow into something magnificent and then having to let him go. They listened with wide eyes, asked 100 questions, and then my daughter, practical and direct like her grandmother, asked the question I'd been expecting. "Is he still alive? Is he still out there?" "I don't know," I admitted. "He'd be 35 years old now. I don't know what the lifespan of a Sasquatch is. Don't know if he's thriving or struggling or if he found others of his kind. But I'd like to think he's still there, still watching over this property, still remembering the family who raised him." "Can we try to find him?" my son asked. "Can we look for signs?" So we started a new ritual, my children and I. Once a month, we'd hike deep into the forest, following paths I remembered from childhood, looking for signs of Cedar's presence. Sometimes we found them, painted rocks or stacked stones or trees marked with deliberate scratches that could have been natural but probably weren't. My children learned to recognize these signs, learned the language of communication Cedar and I had developed decades ago. And then, in October 2023, something extraordinary happened. My daughter, 13 years old and fearless, like I'd been at her age, went further into the forest than we usually ventured. She was gone for almost 2 hours before I started to panic. Before I called her name and got no response, I was about to call search and rescue when she came running back through the trees, her face flushed with excitement and wonder. "Mom," she said, grabbing my hands, "I saw him. I saw Cedar. He's real. Everything you told us is real." My heart stopped. "Where? Is he okay?" She led me and my son deeper into the forest, to a place I'd never explored before. And there, in a clearing surrounded by ancient redwoods, was something that took my breath away. A structure made from branches and logs and natural materials, carefully constructed to blend with the forest. A shelter. And sitting in front of it, massive and magnificent and unmistakably Cedar, was the creature I'd raised from infancy. He was older now, his reddish-brown fur streaked with gray, his movements a little slower, but his eyes were the same, intelligent and kind and full of recognition when he saw me. He stood slowly, his full 9 feet of height, making him tower over us, and for a moment I was 9 years old again, standing in a barn with a helpless infant, promising to protect him forever. "Little mother," he signed. his movements slower than I remembered, but still clear. "You came. You found me." "Cedar," I signed back, my hands shaking, tears streaming down my face. "You're alive. You're here. I've missed you so much." "I missed you," he signed, "but I am good. I am free, and I am not alone." That's when I saw them. Two smaller figures emerging from the forest behind Cedar, young ones maybe 4 and 6 years old, covered in fur that was lighter than Cedar's, their faces curious and cautious as they watched us. And behind them, a female nearly as large as Cedar, with reddish-brown fur and eyes that held the same intelligence I'd seen in Cedar's. "You have a family," I whispered, understanding washing over me. "Cedar, you found others. You're not alone." "Found mate," he signed, gesturing to the female. "Found clan, small clan, far away. She came here. We made family together." He pointed to the young ones. "Daughter, son, I teach them what you teach me. Love, kindness, not to fear all humans. Some humans good. You good." I knelt down, making myself small and non-threatening, and gestured for the young ones to come closer. They approached cautiously, hiding behind their father's massive legs, peeking at me and my children with obvious curiosity. I signed hello, introducing myself and my children, showing them the same gentle signs Cedar had learned as an infant. And slowly, carefully, Cedar's daughter reached out and touched my hand, her fingers warm and surprisingly soft. My daughter and son stood frozen, watching this impossible interaction, this meeting between species that shouldn't be possible. And I realized that the story I'd started when I was 9 years old wasn't over. It was continuing, evolving, being passed down to a new generation. Cedar had survived, had thrived, had found his place in the world, and he'd brought his family to meet the family that raised him, completing a circle that had begun 37 years earlier, in a cold February dawn. We visited them several times over the following months, always careful, always discreet, never staying too long or drawing attention. Cedar taught his children to recognize us, to understand that we were safe, that we were family, and in return, I taught my children what my parents had taught me, that love transcends species, that protection sometimes means sacrifice, that some secrets are worth keeping for a lifetime. I'm 47 years old now, and the secret I've kept for 38 years is bigger than it was when it began. It's not just about one orphaned infant anymore. It's about a family, a clan, a future. Cedar's daughter is growing fast, already showing signs of the intelligence and gentleness her father has. His son is more cautious, more wild, but he watches and learns and trusts. And somewhere in these forests, hidden and protected, a species that shouldn't exist continues to survive. When I'm gone, my children will carry this secret. They'll protect Cedar's family the way I protected Cedar. And maybe someday their children will do the same, generation after generation, keeping watch over these magnificent creatures who live just beyond the edge of what the world believes is real. It's a burden, yes, but it's also a privilege. A reminder that there are still mysteries in the world, still wonders hiding in the wild places, still reasons to hope that love and protection can make a difference. Cedar gave me a gift when I was 9 years old. He gave me purpose, responsibility, and a connection to something greater than myself. And now, watching him with his own children, seeing him pass on the lessons we taught him, I understand that the gift goes both ways. We saved him, but he saved us too. He taught us about compassion, about sacrifice, about what it means to love something so much you're willing to change your entire life to protect it. That's the truth I've never been able to tell until now. That's the story of how a 9-year-old girl and an orphaned baby became family, and how that family grew to include something the world says can't exist. I don't know how much longer Cedar will live, how many more years we'll have these secret visits in the forest. But I know that what we built together, the bond we formed, will outlast all of us. It will live on in his children, in my children, in the secret that gets passed down and protected and honored. Some people might say we should have revealed Cedar to the world, that science and humanity deserve to know about him. But I disagree. Cedar deserved to live on his own terms, to be free, to find his own kind and build his own family. And that's exactly what he did. We gave him that chance, that choice, and he used it to create something beautiful and wild and impossible. That's what love does. It protects, it sacrifices, it lets go when holding on would be selfish. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it comes back to you in ways you never expected, transformed but still recognizably itself. Cedar came back to me, not as the helpless infant I'd rescued, but as a father, a protector, a survivor who chose to share his new life with the woman who'd given him his first one. I don't regret any of it. Not the lies we told, not the isolation we endured, not the fear we lived with every day. Because on the other side of all that difficulty was something pure and true and worth every sacrifice we made. We proved that different doesn't mean dangerous, that unknown doesn't mean unworthy of protection, that family is defined by love and choice rather than biology. Cedar taught me that. And now I'm teaching it to my children, and someday they'll teach it to theirs. The secret will live on, passed from generation to generation, a testament to what's possible when you choose compassion over fear, when you choose to protect rather than exploit, when you choose love even when it costs you everything. That's my story. The truth about what happened when a 9-year-old girl found an orphaned baby Bigfoot in the winter of 1986. What happened when we raised him, loved him, and eventually had to let him go? What happened when love proved stronger than fear, when family meant everything, when an impossible choice led to an impossible life that was somehow exactly what we were meant to live? I'm 47 years old now, and I'm still keeping the secret, still protecting Cedar and his family, still hiking into the forest to find those painted rocks and stacked stones that tell me he's there, he's safe, he remembers. And someday when I'm gone, my children will do the same. Because that's what family does. We protect each other, we keep each other's secrets, we love each other through everything. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that family includes a creature covered in reddish-brown fur, who learned to sign, who learned to love, who learned to be something the world says can't exist, but is more real than anything I've ever known.